Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. My name is Eric, and today we're going to be going over another unconventional Commander deck. We are returning yet again to Adventures in the Forgotten Realms. This time we are going to be putting Nihiloor into the command zone. And Nihiloor is an Esper commander. It's a 3/5 horror that costs 2 white, blue, black. And when Nihiloor enters the battlefield, for each opponent, tap up to 1 untapped creature you control. When you do, gain control of target creature that player controls, with power less than or equal to the tapped creature's power, for as long as you control Nihiloor. Also, whenever you attack with a creature an opponent owns, you gain 2 life and that player loses 2 life. So I received a request to do a deck tech for Nihiloor, and at first I was skeptical of this commander. Nihiloor can steal up to 3 creatures when it enters the battlefield, if you're playing a 4-player game, which is awesome, but you need to have untapped high-power creatures on the battlefield to really take advantage of this ability. And if Nihiloor dies or otherwise leaves the battlefield, you lose those creatures that you stole. So Nihiloor is very conditional, but it's also very powerful. So it's a great strategy that you have to invest a lot into, but then you can be really rewarded when you do. Now, one thing we like to do on this channel, of course, is build unconventional decks. If we look at common cards that are included in Nihiloor decks on EDHREC, you'll see lots of theft effects. There's plenty of other spells and creatures that let you steal your opponent's creatures or other permanents or even their spells. You can steal things from your opponent's battlefields or their libraries or their graveyards or whatever. And all of these extra theft effects do synergize with Nihiloor because Nihiloor has 2 abilities, remember. That first ability, Nihiloor's Enter the Battlefield effect, will let you conditionally steal your opponent's creatures. But Nihiloor's second ability rewards you by letting you drain your opponents and gain some life whenever you attack with one of their creatures. And this ability doesn't care how you stole that creature. So if I steal an opponent's creature with some other effect, like Mind Flayer, Nihiloor will still let me gain 2 life and have that creature's owner lose 2 life whenever that stolen creature attacks. So when building your own Nihiloor, I think we'll gain advantage from both its first and second abilities, since they're somewhat related, but we probably also want to really focus on one or the other. And in this deck, we're focusing on the first ability. So I'm not going to summarize my playstyle or win conditions or how I've built Nihiloor here, we're just going to get straight into what's in the deck. Hint, there are vampires. But why? Let's not trouble ourselves with that yet. First, Nihiloor has the Enters the Battlefield effect, so let's talk about Blink. So Nihiloor has an ETB effect, and we're in Esper colors, so we have access to the best and most numerous Blink cards in the game, so we probably want to play Blink effects so we can get Nihiloor's ETB effect as many times as possible without, repeatedly casting it from the command zone. And before we get into these Blink effects, I want to point out 2 things. First, when we blink Nihiloor, yes, we can steal new creatures. But since Nihiloor will be leaving the battlefield, we'll also lose control of any creatures that Nihiloor has already stolen, so that's not great. And secondly, there are 2 specific ways that the rules text on Blink cards can be written, at least that we care about today. Ephemerate, for example, lets you exile a target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. Cloud Shift, on the other hand, lets you exile a target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under your control. Now that difference matters because when we steal a creature with Nihiloor, this effect is fragile. Again, we can lose control of that stolen creature if Nihiloor goes away, and that would make us very sad. So if I steal a big, juicy creature with Nihiloor's triggered ability, and then cast Cloud Shift on that stolen creature, it will return to the battlefield under my control. But now it's a new creature. It was no longer stolen by Nihiloor. If Nihiloor leaves the battlefield later, I will still get to keep my stolen creature that I blinked with Cloud Shift. And that's why these specific type of blink effects that return the blinked creature to the battlefield under your control are so awesome with Nihiloor, because they give some resilience to that steal effect. So I can use these blink effects either on Nihiloor to steal new things, or on things I've already stolen to protect my investment. We'll use Ghostly Flicker, which is pretty similar to Cloud Shift. It's an instant that lets you blink up to 2 target artifacts, creatures, and/or lands you control, then return them to the battlefield under your control. This is a bit pricey at 3 mana, but since Nihiloor can steal up to 3 creatures at a time, Ghostly Flicker is great to help protect at least 2 of those stolen creatures, if your opponents try to kill Nihiloor. Hint, they will. We've also got great repeatable blink effects like Conjurer's Closet, Thassa Deep Dwelling, both of which let you blink a creature you control at the beginning of each of your end steps, and that blinked creature returns to the battlefield, again under your control, so you can blink things that Nihiloor has stolen. Or you can just blink Nihiloor to steal more things. These are kind of obvious high-value blink engines in this deck. I don't really have too much more to say about them. Now, there are a few other blink effects that are worded like Cloud Shift, and these are the ones we just talked about. These blink effects that let us protect our creatures that we've stolen with Nihiloor. But the ones that I haven't mentioned here, things like Nephalia Smuggler, Synod Sanctum, they're harder to use, so I didn't really go too far down this route, just to ensure that the deck functions more smoothly. But we will still include other blink effects. I mentioned Ephemerate, which won't let us protect our stolen creatures since the blinked creature returns to the battlefield under its owner's control, but we can still use Ephemerate on Nihiloor to let us steal more things. And we can still blink other creatures in our deck that have ETB effects, and of course we have more of those, but we'll talk about those later. So we'll take these repeatable blink effects that just give us continual value throughout the game, like Soul Herder, a Teleportation Circle. These are just more effects that let us blink a creature at the beginning of each of our end steps. But again, just be aware that you don't want to use these specific ones on stolen creatures, since it returns the creature to the battlefield under its owner's control. But let's face reality for a moment here. Let's say we're successful and we've stolen our opponent's biggest, nastiest creatures. And if Nihiloor leaves the battlefield, our opponents get those creatures back. So we've given our 3 opponents really good incentive to get rid of Nihiloor. And even if we have a few blink effects that help us protect those stolen creatures, I really think we still need to de-incentivize our opponents from killing Nihiloor, and of course prevent them from getting their stolen creatures back. Let's talk about that next. Now, what better way to discourage our opponents from killing Nihiloor than by threatening to sacrifice the creatures we've stolen so that our opponents won't get those creatures back, even if Nihiloor dies. Now, we don't want too many instant speed sacrifice effects. We want these sacrifice outlets as permanents, just sitting on the battlefield, staring our opponents in their angry little faces, and just letting them know that killing Nihiloor will not give them the results they want. Whatever we've stolen, they're not getting it back, because we can just sacrifice it if they try to kill Nihiloor. Also, let's talk about vampires. Viscera Seer is our classic sacrifice outlet. It's a 1-mana 1/1, it lets you just sacrifice a creature whenever you want for free, and you scry 1. But there's plenty of others. Yahenni Undying Partisan, Bloodthrone Vampire, Bloodflow Connoisseur, these are more vampire sacrifice outlets that don't cost any mana to use. Yahenni also gets bigger as your opponent's creatures die, and it becomes indestructible until end of turn whenever you sacrifice a creature, so it's hard to remove. And Bloodthrone Vampire and Bloodflow Connoisseur get bigger when you sacrifice creatures to them, and that's important too, but we'll talk more about that later. We've got a couple of sacrifice outlets that cost mana, but they're worth it. Pitiless Pontiff lets you pay 1 and sacrifice a creature, and when you do, Pitiless Pontiff gains Indestructible and Death Touch until end of turn, so it's resilient and the Death Touch makes it a good blocker. Indulgent Aristocrat is a 1-mana 1/1 vampire with lifelink, and you can pay 2 and sacrifice a creature. That's a lot, but then you get to put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control, so that's a nice buff for most of your team, and I think it's well worth that 2-mana cost. And then we'll include a big splashy sacrifice outlet in Vishkal Blood Arbiter. This is a 5/5 vampire with flying and lifelink that costs 7 mana, that's 4 white, black, black, and you can sacrifice a creature to put X +1/+1 counters on Vishkal, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. You can also remove all +1/+1 counters from Vishkal to have target creature get -1/-1 until end of turn for each counter removed this way. So again, Vishkal is our big payoff sacrifice outlet. This guy can get huge and just swing in for large amounts of damage, and give us a bunch of life back with his lifelink too. And it doesn't cost any mana to sacrifice creatures. Vishkal is definitely a removal magnet, but, well, let's enjoy it as long as we can. And of course we'll play High Market, because having a sacrifice outlet on a land is very convenient. Of course you could also use Phyrexian Tower too. I chose not to for budget reasons, but definitely if you've got it, use it. And finally, I want to talk about Athreos Shroud Veiled. This is a 4/7 god that costs 4 white-black, it's indestructible, and if your devotion to white and black is less than 7, it isn't a creature. And Athreos has, at the beginning of your end step, put a coin counter on another target creature, and whenever a creature with the coin counter on it dies or is put into exile, return that card to the battlefield under your control. So Athreos isn't a sacrifice outlet, but it really gives us value from our sacrifice effects. And you can put coin counters on any creature, it doesn't matter who controls it. And when that creature dies or is exiled, it returns to the battlefield under your control. So when you combine Athreos with a sacrifice outlet, you can protect creatures that you've stolen with Nihiloor by putting a coin counter on them and then sacrificing them if Nihiloor gets targeted with removal. Of course, Athreos can also help you steal new creatures by putting coin counters on your opponent's creatures and then killing them. Athreos is also hard to remove, so it's just a lot of value for us in this deck. But our vampires in this deck aren't just sacrifice outlets. We'll also tap our vampires to Nihiloor's ETB effect to steal our opponent's creatures. But remember, we need to have high power creatures on the battlefield to really get a lot of value from this, because whatever creature we want to steal, we need to tap a creature with equal or greater power. Now we've hinted at powering up our creatures a bit, but let's talk about that in more detail. So again, when Nihiloor enters the battlefield, we can steal up to 1 creature from each opponent, as long as we can tap a creature we control with power greater than or equal to the power of the creature we want to steal. So we need creatures with high power. Now I already mentioned some of our sacrifice outlets, like Bloodthrone Vampire for example, lets you sacrifice a creature to give it +2/+2 until end of turn. And this is great because we can sacrifice a few creatures to increase Bloodthrone Vampire's power, maybe even creatures we stole from our opponents, and then we cast Nihiloor, or blink it if it's already on the field, and tap Bloodthrone Vampire to steal even bigger creatures. And we already mentioned some of our other sacrifice outlets as well that get bigger when they sacrifice something, which again lets us tap them to steal big creatures with Nihiloor. But there's a ton of cards in this deck that pump up our creature's power so that our commander's steal ability is more effective. Radiant Destiny is an enchantment that lets you pick a creature type, and creatures you control of that type get +1/+1, and if you have the City's Blessing, they also get Vigilance. And that Vigilance is great too, because if you have a big attacker like Vishkal, then you can attack with it and then blink or cast Nihiloor after combat, and still tap Vishkal to help you steal something. Blade of the Bloodchief is a vampire deck staple. This equipment gives the equipped creature a +1/+1 counter whenever any creature dies, or 2 +1/+1 counters if the equipped creature is a vampire. Speaking of creatures dying, Cordial Vampire puts a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control whenever Cordial Vampire or another creature dies. Now I really like Heirloom Blade. This is another equipment. It costs 3, it equips for 1, and the equipped creature gets +3/+1. So that's a pretty good power boost for such a low equip cost. And it also has, whenever the equipped creature dies, you get to reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card that shares a type with it, and you put that card into your hand. This is a great tribal card to help us replace our dead vampires with more vampires, and it's also a great power boost to help us steal creatures with Nihiloor. Of course, we'll use Legion Lieutenant, a 2-mana Vampire Lord that gives all of your vampires +1/+1. Captivating Vampire does the same, it costs 3 mana, but it also lets you tap 5 untapped vampires you control to gain control of target creature. And that creature also becomes a vampire in addition to its other creature types. Now we're not using a lot of steal effects in this deck outside of Nihiloor, but Captivating Vampire is a perfect fit, as it's both an anthem for our vampires and a repeatable steal effect all in one. Now I've really been impressed with Bloodline Keeper. This is a 3/3 flying vampire that costs 2 black, and you can tap it to make a 2/2 vampire token with flying. You can also pay black to transform it, but you can only activate this ability if you control 5 or more vampires. And it transforms into Lord of Lineage, which is a monstrous 5/5 flyer that can still tap to make 2/2 vampire tokens. Oh, and it also gives all of your other vampires +2/+2. So those 2/2 flyers that you make are actually 4/4s. This card is an absolute monster and will run away with games if left unchecked. And the 4-mana casting cost is very reasonable. It is $15, but I chose to include it in the deck anyways because it's just that awesome. What about Sorin, Lord of Innistrad? This is a 4-mana 3 loyalty Sorin Planeswalker, It has a +1 to make a 1/1 vampire token with lifelink, but it also has a -2 to give you an emblem with creatures you control get +1/+0. Perfect. Now we already mentioned Yahenni, which gets bigger when an opponent's creature dies, but we'll also use Patron of the Vein, a 4/4 flying vampire that costs 6, and when it enters the battlefield you get to destroy target creature an opponent controls, and it also has whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, exile it and put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. So again, more of that power boost. And don't forget we have a lot of blink effects in this deck too, so Patron of the Vein is potentially repeatable removal. We've got Blood Tracker. This is a 2/2 flying vampire that costs 4, and you can pay a black mana and 2 life to put a +1/+1 counter on it. So you can make it bigger as much as you need to, as long as you've got the life and mana to pay for it. And you also draw a card for each +1/+1 counter on Blood Tracker whenever it leaves the battlefield, so that's great. Again, with any of our blink effects, you can trigger that card draw when you need it, or you can do that with your sacrifice effects too, you just don't get it back when you do that. Now when it comes to ramp, we've also got a few pieces that help buff our creatures. Heraldic Banner is a 3-mana rock that only taps for a single color of your choice, which isn't great, but it also gives all creatures you control of that color +1/+0. Most of our creatures are black, and black is definitely the most abundant color in this deck, so it works well for us even though we're playing a 3-color deck. A Caged Sun is similar. It's a 6-mana artifact, and when it enters the battlefield, you pick a color, and whenever you tap a land for that color of mana, you get another mana of that color. And creatures you control of the chosen color get +1/+1. Again, Caged Sun usually probably doesn't fit in a 3-color deck, but we're so heavy in black in this deck that it works out for us. And again, it buffs our creatures. And finally, as long as we're talking about making it easier to steal things with Nihiloor, we need to mention Sudden Spoiling. This is an instant that costs 1 black, and it has Split Second. And until end of turn, creatures target player controls lose all abilities and have base power and toughness 0/2 until end of turn. Now, Sudden Spoiling is a good card in a vacuum, but it's even better here. First, we can steal just about any creature with Nihiloor, since it reduces the base power of all creatures target player controls to 0. Secondly, if your opponent has some big hexproof monster, Sudden Spoiling removes all abilities, including hexproof, so now you're able to target it with Nihiloor and steal it. But don't worry, at the end of the turn the creature will go back to being a scary hexproof monster, it'll just be under your control. So we've covered our sacrifice outlets to discourage our opponents from killing Nihiloor. We've talked about how to boost our creature's power to make it easier to steal things with Nihiloor. And a lot of the cards that do these things are vampires, and they synergize with vampires. But we have even more vampire payoffs in the deck. Let's talk about those too. First, we'll play Blood Artist and Cruel Celebrant. These are Aristocrat deck staples. We're not playing an Aristocrats deck exactly, but we do have a bunch of sacrifice outlets, and these guys will just give us incidental value throughout the game. And of course, they're vampires. We have vampires for card draw too. Dusk Legion Zealot and Callous Blood Mage each draw us a card when they enter the battlefield, so they're also great blink targets. Callous Blood Mage can also alternatively exile target player's graveyard or make a pest token when it enters, and I found both of these other modes to be situationally useful as well. Champion of Dusk is our big blinkable card draw vampire. It's a 5-mana 4/4, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw X cards and lose X life, where X is the number of vampires you control. And of course we already mentioned Blood Tracker. So all of these card draw outlets make us lose life in order to draw cards, and that's why some of those life gain effects are really important, like our Blood Artist, or our Vishkal, or even Nihiloor's second ability. Now we've also got Vampire-based Ramp in Pawn of Ulamog, which gives you an Eldrazi spawn token whenever one of your non-token creatures dies. So with all of our sacrifice outlets, Pawn of Ulamog will do some work. Now as long as we're playing with vampires, we'll use New Blood, which is a 4-mana sorcery that lets us steal an opponent's creature permanently, and it even turns it into a vampire. But as an additional cost to cast New Blood, you'll need to tap an untapped vampire you control. And like I said, we're not running very many steal effects outside of Nihiloor, but I think this one is worth it, and it fits the tribal theme perfectly. And finally, I want to mention a few of the other vampires that we're using. Maverick Fane makes a 1/1 vampire token with lifelink whenever you attack with one or more non-token vampires. Now, we're not playing a token deck, but having the extra tokens here is great to be able to use our sacrifice outlets like Indulgent Aristocrat to grow our team, without sacrificing something useful. Forerunner of the Legion helps you find whatever vampire you need for the situation, and we have vampires for most of the deck's functions, like card draw, ramp removal, our sacrifice outlets. There's Bloodline Necromancer, which has an ETB that lets you return a vampire or a wizard from your graveyard to the battlefield. Of course, we love ETBs in this deck. There's Vampire Spawn and Vampire Sovereign. These also have ETBs that drain our opponents, or at least just a single target opponent for Vampire Sovereign. And these effects gain life for us. Now, if we can blink these guys repeatedly, we can actually do a pretty good amount of damage and maybe knock out weakened opponents. And I like having a couple of these cards in the deck because they give us some way to finish games outside of the combat step. And finally, we can use tribal payoffs like Pact of the Serpent, which lets us draw cards based on how many creatures you have of a chosen type, or Haunting Voyage, which lets you return 2 creature cards of a chosen type from your graveyard to the battlefield for 6 mana. Or you can foretell it for 2 mana and then cast it later for 7 mana to return all creatures of the chosen type from your graveyard to the battlefield. Honestly, Rise of the Dark Realms is generally better, but it's also $15. So that is the deck. Let's go over the deck stats and cost. Alright, deck stats. This Nihiloor Vampire Tribal deck has an average mana value of 3.03. We have 28 creatures, not counting our commander, and of those, 24 are vampires. Now, in most tribal creature decks, you'll probably want a few more than 24 cards of the tribe that your deck is built around, and that's honestly part of the trade-off that we make with this deck because we aren't just vampire tribal, we're also stealing our opponent's things, and we're playing with a blink sub-theme, so there just aren't as many deck slots available for vampires. We have 8 blink effects in this deck, or blink-ish cards like Athreos Shroud Veiled. 5 of those effects are repeatable blink effects that will give us lots of value throughout the game. We also have 8 sacrifice outlets that we can use to deny our opponents the opportunity to get their stolen creatures back by killing Nihiloor, and lots of those sacrifice effects, like Bloodflow Connoisseur for example, also grow themselves or your team when you sacrifice things, making it easier to steal creatures with Nihiloor. In fact, we have 19 total effects that deal with increasing our creature's power so that Nihiloor lets us steal bigger things. Now, I'm counting effects that statically buff our creatures like Legion Lieutenant, or actively like Indulgent Aristocrat. I'm also counting creatures that situationally buff themselves like Blood Tracker or Bloodthrone Vampire. Now, we also have 12 pieces of card draw and 8 pieces of ramp. And finally, we have 9 pieces of single target removal and 2 board wipes. I'm counting steal effects like New Blood as single target removal, but I'm not counting Nihiloor's Enter the Battlefield effect since it's kind of situational, since we need creatures on the board to tap to steal a creature, and if Nihiloor dies we lose control of the stolen creature. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $178.89 on TCGplayer.com. And that is Nihiloor Vampire Tribal. So I really liked playing this deck. Nihiloor can be very powerful, but also very gimmicky and unreliable. But since we're playing Vampire Tribal, this deck is capable of winning the game without Nihiloor. You won't feel pressured to cast Nihiloor as soon as possible, you won't feel like you need to play gimmicky cards that are good at tapping to steal creatures with Nihiloor, but bad at everything else. You can just play your vampires and do your thing, and when you feel like you want to reach across the table and take that shiny new thing your opponent just deployed, you can cast your Nihiloor and do that. But Nihiloor is still relevant, it's still good in this deck. Stealing your opponent's creatures is always potentially good, but if your opponents don't have good cards to steal, or if your board just isn't set up to steal big creatures or protect them with blink effects or sacrifice effects, then you can just continue on with your vampire plan until you're ready to use Nihiloor. There's also a lot of decision making that comes with piloting this deck. Do you cast Nihiloor early to try to disrupt your opponents, or do you wait until you have high power creatures and a sacrifice outlet to make sure your opponents don't get to take back whatever you've stolen by killing Nihiloor? Do you blink Nihiloor to steal more things, or do you blink something you've stolen to prevent your opponent from getting it back? Or do you blink one of your value vampires that lets you draw cards or kill something or whatever? We're playing Sacrifice Elves to make your creatures bigger so Nihiloor can steal bigger things, and to prevent your opponents from getting their stolen stuff back. But we're also not playing a tokens or aristocrats deck, so you won't have tons of sacrifice fodder. So you'll need to be very intentional about what you choose to sacrifice. You can sacrifice lots of your creatures to consolidate all of the power into a big Vish Cowl or something, and help you steal about a large creature, but sometimes it's better to have several small creatures on the board instead of one large creature. So again, there's a lot of decision points when playing this deck, and so it was a pretty fun deck to play. That is all I've got for today. Let me know in the comments if there are any commanders or deck themes you'd like to see made into a commander deck on this channel, especially ones that have opportunities for unconventional builds. I think we'll be getting Innistrad Midnight Hunt spoilers soon, but I typically don't create deck techs right away when first spoilers are revealed for a set. I generally like to see the whole set before I start building decks from it. So that means I've probably got several weeks available to me to make content for any commander or theme, new or old, before we start focusing on the Innistrad Midnight Hunt material. But that is all I've got for today. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.